If your government told you tomorrow that your tap water came from treated sewage, would you drink it? Singapore's founding leader didn't just answer that question for himself. He answered it for 6 million people. When Singapore was suddenly forced to separate from Malaysia against its will, without the negotiations it had hoped for, Lee Kuan Yew, whether he liked it or not, had become the founding father and leader of a nation. The city of 2 million had become a country overnight. It had no army, no significant economy, and worst of all, almost no water of its own. It was surrounded by larger neighbors who saw its independence as either a mistake or an opportunity. A country whose survival no one was sure of. What would you do in such a situation? You have a country that is 728 square kilometers in your hands. That's smaller than New York City, smaller than London, surrounded entirely by sea. You can drive across the entire country in 40 minutes. No rivers of meaningful size, no aquifers, almost no natural water storage whatsoever. That was the situation with Singapore and Lee. When it broke away from Malaysia, it had virtually no fresh water of its own and faced 2 water treaties. Half the nation's water supply depended on these Singapore-Malaysia agreements. The Malaysian Prime Minister at the time, Tunku Abdul Rahman, was explicit. He openly said that if Singapore's foreign policy didn't suit him, he could simply switch off the water. In other words, Singapore's entire future could be turned off, with a valve. Lee Kuan Yew didn't sleep well after 1965. How do you build a country that cannot be held hostage by the thing every human being needs to survive? The answer took 50 years to fully build, but its logic was established almost immediately. New taps had to be found. The first tap was the oldest one, rain. Lee began surveying the island, methodically, to understand how much water it could collect. The answer was discouraging. Most of the island's rivers drained into the sea within hours of rainfall. The reservoir system was small, and much of the catchment area was contaminated. Pig farms, squatter settlements, and light industry had turned Singapore's waterways into open drains. You couldn't drink what fell on this island, even if you caught it. So before Singapore could build water independence, it had to build a clean island first. In 1977, Lee Kuan Yew launched what became known as the Clean Rivers Campaign. The stated goal was environmental. The strategic goal was water security. Over the following decade, 2,800 pig farms were shut down or relocated. Thousands of shanty towns along the riverbanks were demolished, sometimes by force. Industries were pushed away from catchment areas, and the Singapore River and Kelang Basin, which were literally open sewers at the time, were cleaned over 10 long years at an enormous political and economic cost. When Lee declared the rivers clean 10 years later, the environmental victory was real, but the strategic achievement was water. Singapore had effectively doubled the island's usable catchment area. Water that once had to be discarded as contaminated could now be collected, treated, and stored. This was the first phase of what would become a 50-year strategy. Its logic was simple: solve the problem before it becomes a crisis, using whatever political capital is required, regardless of the short-term cost. Even in the early 1970s, Singapore's water engineers were studying advanced treatment technologies. Not because they were ready to deploy them, but because they understood the direction the country would eventually have to go. A 1974 pilot study explored whether used water could be purified to drinking standard using membrane filtration. The results were technically promising. The economics were not. The membranes were expensive, fragile, and far beyond what a city-scale system could sustain. The pilot was shelved. The question was not. For the next 2 decades, the idea remained in the background of Singapore's water planning, revisited, postponed, and quietly monitored as the technology evolved elsewhere. In the United States, Europe, and Japan, membrane systems were steadily improving. Reverse osmosis was becoming more efficient, more durable, and gradually cheaper. Anyone watching closely could see where the technology was heading. Singapore was watching. Meanwhile, the relationship with Malaysia was shifting. Periodic disputes over water pricing. Malaysia periodically argued the 1961 agreement rates were too low given inflation, kept the vulnerability visible at the highest levels of government. Every time Kuala Lumpur raised the water issue, Singapore's leadership was reminded that the agreements were not permanent, that goodwill was not infrastructure, and that the day the leash pulled taut was a day Singapore was not yet ready for. The 1997 Asian financial crisis deepened this awareness. Malaysia's economy contracted severely. The political climate between the two countries grew tense. And Singapore's planners, watching the instability next door, drew the obvious conclusion. Dependency on a neighbor experiencing political and economic turbulence is not a water policy. It is a gamble. Tap 1 was working. The Clean Rivers campaign had transformed the island's catchment capacity, and the reservoir network was steadily expanding. Tap 2, Malaysian imports, was still flowing, still indispensable, still a dependency that every bilateral dispute made uncomfortable. Singapore had been reducing that dependency year by year, quietly, deliberately. By the late 1990s, investment in water research accelerated. The Public Utilities Board had concluded that the economic barrier to advanced treatment technologies was nearing a tipping point, not yet crossed, but close. And the combination of regional instability and the shock of the 1997 crisis compressed the timeline. Singapore could no longer afford to wait for the technology to become comfortable. It needed to move. The decision was made to build 2 full-scale demonstration plants, not laboratory pilots or feasibility studies, but real operational facilities capable of producing meaningful volumes of treated water. The plants came online around 2000, and the results did more than confirm that NEWater was viable. They revealed something few had anticipated. The water was not just safe, it was extraordinarily pure. The 3-stage treatment process, microfiltration, reverse osmosis, and ultraviolet disinfection, produced water that exceeded WHO drinking standards by a significant margin. That part was expected. What surprised many was the reaction from Singapore's semiconductor industry. Microchip fabrication requires water of extreme purity, water so clean that even trace minerals measured in parts per billion can disrupt a production run. These factories had been importing ultra-pure water at considerable cost. When NEWater became available, they tested it. Then they requested it. Then they switched. The water some people hesitated to drink was, in industrial terms, purer than the water many high-tech processes had relied on. But public acceptance was harder and took longer. Singapore studied what had happened in California, where a recycled water program collapsed in 1994 after public debate reduced it to 3 damaging words: toilet to tap. The lesson was clear. The technology was not the obstacle, the psychology was. Singapore's response was unusually direct. Rather than downplaying the origin of the water, the government chose transparency. Treatment plants were open to visitors. Public education campaigns explained the process step by step. And most importantly, the water was given a name. Not reclaimed water, not advanced treated water, NEWater. 2 syllables that acknowledged the transformation without apologizing for its origin. Water made from what had once been used, processed into something fundamentally different. The name did not ask the public for blind trust. It offered transparency instead, and assumed transparency would eventually build trust on its own. In 2002, at Singapore's National Day Parade, Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong stood before 60,000 people and raised a bottle of NEWater. He did not explain the filtration process. He did not cite safety certifications or the hundreds of thousands of laboratory tests. He simply drank it, on the most watched day of the year. The crowd had bottles too, distributed at the entrance. Many drank as well. Millions watching at home saw something no government campaign could fully convey. The people who understood exactly what this water was, and who had every alternative available, had chosen to drink it. At the same time, the introduction of NEWater was carefully sequenced. It was first blended into reservoirs in small proportions, mixed with rainwater, and released gradually into the national supply. The process was publicly disclosed but quietly normalized. By the time many Singaporeans began asking whether they would accept treated wastewater, they had already been drinking it for months. The fear of the unknown is always larger than the experience of the already encountered. Singapore engineered the sequence so that encounter came before opinion, not after it. The 4 National Taps framework was formally named and publicly introduced in the early 2000s, when Singapore brought all 4 water sources into operation at the same time. The naming was deliberate, a signal that water independence was no longer just a goal, but a system already in place. Tap 1, local catchment. Tap 2, imported water. Tap 3, desalination, which came online with the SingSpring plant in 2005. Tap 4, NEWater. 3 of these taps had already been explained, 1 had not. Desalination appeared in the framework, listed 3rd, and then largely set aside, because for most of Singapore's history, it simply wasn't ready. The technology existed, the economics didn't, and Singapore, characteristically, waited until both aligned before committing. Seawater is not undrinkable in principle. The challenge is scale. Turning it into fresh water requires forcing water molecules through membranes at extremely high pressure while leaving salt ions behind, a process known as reverse osmosis, the same core technology used in NEWater. The method works, but it demands enormous energy and expensive infrastructure. For decades, the cost of desalinated water remained far above what most urban water systems could realistically afford. Through the 1980s and 1990s, however, Singapore watched those costs steadily decline. Advances in membrane technology and the construction of massive desalination plants in the Middle East gradually changed the economics. The same strategy Singapore had applied to NEWater applied here as well. Study the technology, wait for it to mature, and move when the moment arrives. That moment came in the early 2000s. Singapore signed an agreement with a private consortium to build the SingSpring desalination plant in Tuas, on the island's western coast. When it opened in 2005, it became the country's first large-scale desalination facility, capable of producing 136,000 cubic meters of fresh water each day from the surrounding Strait of Singapore. Strategically, desalination offered something NEWater could not. NEWater closed the loop on water already inside the system, recovering and purifying what had been used. Desalination created an entirely new source, and unlike rivers or rainfall, the ocean surrounding Singapore is effectively limitless. It cannot be owned by another country, it cannot run dry, and it cannot be turned off by a political decision made in Kuala Lumpur or anywhere else. By the early 2000s, Singapore was no longer building defensively. It was building with confidence. Today, 5 NEWater plants operate across the island. Together, they supply roughly 40% of Singapore's total water demand. By 2060, the target is 55%. NEWater doesn't just happen at the treatment plant. Before a single drop reaches the microfiltration membranes, Singapore had to build a system capable of collecting used water from across the entire island efficiently and channeling it to centralized reclamation plants. The DTSS is that system, a network of deep tunnel sewers running as far as 55 meters underground, spanning the length of the island, moving used water by gravity alone to avoid pumping costs. Phase 1 was completed in 2008. Phase 2, which covers the rest of the island, was completed in 2024. The tunnels run so deep, they pass beneath MRT lines, beneath buildings, beneath everything. Singapore essentially built a second city underground, invisible, silent, and entirely dedicated to recovering water that would otherwise be lost. Desalination expanded alongside it. SingSpring was followed by NEWater in 2013, adding another 318,000 cubic meters per day. Then the Tuas desalination plant, then a fourth facility on Jurong Island. Combined, Singapore's desalination capacity can now meet around 30% of national demand on any given day, a figure the country intends to double by mid-century. 2 sources, each capable of supplying nearly a third of the nation's water, each independent of foreign supply, each expandable. Meanwhile, the catchment network continued to grow. Marina Barrage, completed in 2008, transformed the Marina Basin into Singapore's 15th reservoir, the first urban reservoir of its kind, sitting in the heart of the financial district and collecting rainfall from a catchment area covering 1/6 of the entire island. Today, 17 reservoirs are linked by an integrated system of canals and drains that covers roughly 2/3 of Singapore's land surface. Almost every drop of rain that falls on the island now has a path to storage. Singapore's 1961 water agreement with Malaysia, the one that once kept Lee Kuan Yew awake at night, expired in 2011. They did not renew it. They let it go. The second agreement, signed in 1962, will expire in 2061. By then, Singapore intends to be completely water independent. And if current plans hold, it will achieve something no other society has fully attempted before, stepping outside the limits of the natural water cycle and engineering its own. In effect, Singapore has turned its island into a closed-loop system, a kind of high-tech life support machine, where water is captured, purified, reused, and returned again and again. It required half a century of planning, massive infrastructure, political decisions that were often unpopular in the moment, and a willingness to trust technology where instinct alone might hesitate. Singapore has shown that the technology to survive a water-scarce century already exists. The engineering, it turns out, is the manageable part. The harder question is the one we started with. If your government told you that tomorrow your drinking water would come from treated wastewater, cleaner, safer, and more thoroughly tested than what you drink today, would you drink it? Because millions of people already do, every single day. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.